Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues. My name is Teunis van Renen. I'm the Head of Partnerships and Business Development at the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm truly delighted to welcome you to this regional policy dialogue on enhancing cross-border trade and food security through data and information sharing. This policy dialogue was organized and is organized by the Association for Strengthening Agricultural Research in Eastern and Central Africa, ASARECA, and the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. And in particular, would like to contribute towards efforts where we connect research to stakeholders who make decisions so that we have more impact with the work that we do. This is done under the umbrella of two very significant and important projects: the Food Security Portal and the CAADP XP4 project. I'd like to express my appreciation and gratitude to the European Commission and IFAD for the support that they've given to these projects over the many years. Before we start with the policy dialogue, let me give a few housekeeping suggestions and rules. The event will be live streamed and recorded, and links to the recordings will be made available after the event on the ASARECA's website as well as on the Food Security Portal. All participants joining us today will have their microphones muted and their videos turned off. Speakers will turn on their mics and videos during their interventions only. Please submit any questions that you may have to the speakers in the Q&A box. When submitting a question, please also indicate the speaker or speakers to whom the question should be addressed. The Q&A option is found at the bottom of the screen, and please do not wait till the Q&A session with submitting a question. You can do this throughout the whole policy dialogue. Please use the Q&A box only for the questions to be posed to our program speakers. For any other comments or messages, please use the chat box. I'm also really delighted to let you know that we have simultaneous interpretation available throughout the event today. To access this, click Interpretation at the bottom of the screen. Options of English or French will pop up. If selecting interpretation, please also click on Mute Original Audio so that you can clearly hear the language selected. We have a very exciting and packed program today, so I encourage all of our speakers to keep their remarks as concise as possible and to stay within the allocated time. Also, when responding to questions, to really be as concise as possible. Let me now move on to the program of this exciting event, and I would like to call on Dr. Rob Vos to give his welcome remarks. Dr. Rob Vos is the Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and he's in that capacity also the program leader of the Food Security Portal. Dr. Vos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teunis, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar organized by the Food Security Portal, facilitated by IFPRI and ASARECA. The focus of this regional dialogue is on the role of trade and especially intra-regional trade among African countries to improve food security. Food security is severely under threat. After decades of progress, hunger has been on the rise again recently, and especially in many parts of Africa. This is provoked by conflict, adverse weather shocks, and economic crises. The COVID-19 pandemic is now exacerbating these problems and likely leading to unprecedented increases in food insecurity. I say likely because we're still grappling for data that can inform us about the precise magnitude of the impact. What we can say is with some certainty is that food supply chains overall have held up pretty well. World markets for food have remained remarkably stable, and we have not seen anything near the food price instability witnessed during the global food price crisis of 2007 and 2008. On the Food Security Portal, we track world market conditions on a daily basis, so I invite you to check that out too, to get these early warning signals. While markets for staple foods have remained rather stable, food supply chains have not been this resilient everywhere. We have seen major disruptions in Africa where markets were closed, labor and transport mobility were restricted, and this has affected the most the supply of more nutritious foods like fruits, vegetables, dairy, and meat products. The bigger threat to food security and nutrition, however, is the economic crisis provoked by COVID-19 and the necessary containment measures. The economic downturn is hurting jobs and incomes everywhere, and hence the access to food. Some countries have responded by protecting domestic food production, closing borders, and imposing export bans, but such measures tend to be counterproductive, as was the case during the 2007 and 2008 food price crisis, and also now during COVID-19. Export bans by some major wheat and rice producing countries cause short spells of high price volatility in wheat and rice markets during April and May. But luckily, those have subsided with the end of those bans. But trade can help increase resilience of food systems. It can allow for more diverse food supply, reduce the cost of food, and cover for deficits in times of crisis. I emphasize can help, as this is not a panacea. One must create the conditions for trade to play this role. African countries do not seem to tap sufficiently into this potential. Agriculture trade among African countries is extremely low, as far as we can tell from official statistics. Possibly, however, it's higher than the official data tell us, given that there's significant cross-border food trade that goes unrecorded. But even so, trade integration is low. So how can African countries strengthen trade ties to improve the resilience of their food systems? Do we have the evidence that shows that potential? These are central questions for today's regional dialogue. My good friend in ASARECA. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor back to Teunis.
Thank you very much, Rob, for your welcoming remarks and also emphasizing the importance of having good data and information available, and also emphasizing the importance of the food security portal and this event. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Jean-Jacques Mobingaba Muhinda. And I apologize if I didn't pronounce it completely as fluently as I should have, because usually, actually, you ask me to call you JJ. But Professor, the floor is yours. You are the Executive Director of ASARECA, and we look forward to your presentation on data and information sharing in COVID-19 times. A very important topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dennis. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure this morning to also say that we are welcoming you all participants and our valuable speakers to this important regional policy dialogue webinar of this afternoon. So let me straight jump to the question that I was requested to discuss, and this is the role of data and information sharing in enhancing cross-border trade and food security in the COVID-19 times, and also mention about my organization's offering in this situation. I would start by very much agreeing with Rob that the COVID-19 pandemic represents a unique disruption to the global economy and the world trade, since production and consumption are scaled back globally, and our Eastern and Central Africa sub-region is not exempted at all. So today, than ever before, there is a call for a collective responsibility, which is required to stay informed and spread reliable information about the state of food production and trade of agricultural commodities in the sub-region And this will help limiting misinformed trade decisions that would actually disrupt further food markets in the region. So as you might be aware, countries and regional economic blocs across the world are currently exploring opportunities regarding how to put in place effective and coherent policy responses to COVID-19 that support the recovery, the resilience, and to this extent, the availability of quality and up-to-date data is very critical. Even before COVID-19 era, the increasingly globalized world has put more demand for national and international exchange of economic data. So to that effect, numerous international initiatives related to the use, sharing, linking of data have been undertaken in recent years. However, the exchange of data to deal with the challenges in cross-border trade, a movement of agricultural research, and even commodity products remain far from being optimized. Rob has also alluded to this to some extent. Now, over the past decades, a lot of data and information have been generated at national, regional, and even international levels for Africa. However, of these data sets, most of them remain raw in form and offer only partial coverage as far as agricultural research and innovation, but also trade-related knowledge and information is concerned. Even where institutions have, tried to build hubs and portals which provide critical data sets, like the food security portal, which IFPRI has been leading for many years. So these have not been fully really used to promote cross-border trade and enhance agricultural research and innovation, including food security. So the global COVID-19 outbreak calls for more collective action. And I believe that we can learn from proven good practices and even emerging lessons elsewhere to keep food moving in a safe and even affordable way. Recent data, which I was reading through, show that Africa's food systems currently are valued at almost $313 billion a year from agriculture, but this potential could be tripled if government and business leaders radically think their policies and support to agricultural, smallholder farmers, and agribusinesses, which these groups together account for nearly 50% of Africa's economic activity. So that means that African farmers and agribusinesses could create $1 trillion food market by 2030. These are figures I'm quoting from reports from the World Bank, Grow Africa initiatives. If only production systems are optimized and if our government can work together to feed the regional fastest growing population. Looking at the Eastern Africa specifically and considering maize value chain alone, so the total demand currently is estimated at 12.6 million metric tons of grains versus a supply of close to 9.9 million tons. So leaving a deficit of about 2.7 million metric tons. However, as most of researchers know, the ESC is normally a maize surplus region. So the deficit status is mainly caused by several other factors, including export of maize product to some other lucrative markets beyond the ESC, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo or even South Sudan, and mainly from Uganda here. So that illustrates actually limitation in the interregional trade system, which could be explained by several factors, including the lack of information and data. We are pleased to have the Assistant Secretary General for COMESA in this meeting, and we will probably get more insight on this particular area. So finally, I'm asked to say, what does data and information clarify really as far as enhancing cross-border trade and food security is concerned? First of all, we need data and information to clarify, clearance processes and procedures, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, trade regulations, tariff structures, customers rules, export and import commodity restrictions. We need information on the commodity prices, available commodity volumes in different countries, even available commodity types, varieties, breeds, including even the risks associated to the cross-border trades. I believe that the other speakers will also elaborate on some of these aspects. Now, my last part of my comment is what does ASARECA put on the table? My institution, through its 10-year strategic plan and the results framework, is currently in the process of designing what we call the Eastern and Central Africa Regional Knowledge and Information Hub, which is going to be a portal that provides and compiles and shares knowledge and information across the region. So the demand for this hub, as we call it, is driven by the national agricultural research and extension systems, the private sector, development partners who would like to see intensified partnership and coordination in generating, storing, processing, organizing, packaging, clearing, even disseminating agricultural research knowledge and information to increase innovative capability of stakeholders. So we also in an advanced process of creating what we call a community of practice comprising critical data and information experts in the sub-region, especially from the national systems. So this community of practice will be harnessed to facilitate effort and help generating, processing, and even sharing data across the region. For us to achieve this, we are seeking collaboration with the national, regional, international institutions like IFPRI and others to build trust in the governance of data flows in international trade specifically. So this entails working together towards data protection regulations, setting mutual expectation in trade deals, and so on and so forth. So to conclude, once we have the Eastern and Central Africa Information and Knowledge Hub operational, we shall seek partnerships with still other institutions to build the capacity of national systems to process and make available data for sharing at the regional level. So to conclude, Mr. Moderator, I believe, and I believe this is something I share with others, that the best and most effective means for addressing the current COVID-19 crisis on food security at regional level is through sharing timely and accurate information. So we always know that an informed public is better positioned to make sound decisions, including on question of related to food trade regionally or even globally. So Rob have mentioned about data gaps in this period, and I believe this dialogue is timely. So I will stop it at here and over to you back, Tennis.
Thank you very much, Professor Jean-Jacques. This was really a wonderful presentation.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur Jean-Jacques.
I learned a lot from your presentation.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur
Especially also the emphasis on
votre présentation, surtout quand vous avez souligné.
I have the interpreter.
J'ai l'interprète.
Let me see if, because I didn't. No, it's off anyway. I can hear the interpreter in the back. It doesn't matter. I learned a lot, especially also the emphasis on partnerships and working together, and this is really
il faut travailler ensemble,
very insightful. Thank you so much.
I
will now move on to the presentation of my colleague, Dr. Antoine Bouet. He's the Senior Research Fellow in the Market Space and Institutions Division at IFPRI. But before doing this, before giving you the floor, Antoine, I would like to ask and remind everybody that if you have questions, to please put their questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them after his presentation. So, Antoine, the floor is yours, and we look forward to you.
Vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Tennis, and
beaucoup,
thank you for the invitation.
Merci beaucoup
I guess that there is a problem of with the interpreter. We have the voice of the interpreter, so
la voix de l'interprète.
Yes, so Julian, if you maybe could see if this could be resolved one way or the other, because we're talking at the same time somehow.
Yeah, thank you very much.
My colleague is going to rectify that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I will try to share my screen.
Je vais essayer de partager mon écran.
So tell me if you see my screen.
Dites-moi si vous voyez mon écran.
Yeah, it's okay.
Ça va?
Yes, it's okay. We can see it very well.
Oui, ça va. Nous pouvons
okay.
voir clairement.
So thank you very much for the invitation. So this is the structure of my presentation, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to define this crisis, because it's a very unconventional crisis, very different from crises that we have observed in the past. For example, supply crisis or the financial crisis, and the main implication of this crisis is that it has a very different impact by sector and by country. So I would like to explain why. So this is a graph that tries to explain what is this crisis. So it is marked by social distancing and reduced mobility of people. And so it implies, of course, less work, reduced income, less jobs. And so it has an important macroeconomic impact. At the same time, there are less travels, touristic travels, and reduced remittances. So it's really very negative for some country. It also implies reduced demand for oil and energy products, which also affects other countries like Nigeria, Angola in Africa. Reduced remittances has a considerable negative effects on countries like Nigeria also and Egypt, but in relative terms on Lesotho and Gambia, because it represents an important part of their gross domestic products. We see that with data from Western Union, so this is something that we can observe very precisely. Concerning tourism, it affects countries like Egypt, South Africa, but also in relative terms, it is a big shock for countries like Seychelles or Cabo Verde. But of course, so you have already here an explanation of why this crisis has a differentiated impact on African countries, but also because of reduced income and less jobs, you have reduced demand for agricultural products. And when income decreases, in fact, all sectors in the agricultural sector are not affected equally. This is because, of course, demand for food is relatively inelastic. People need to buy food because this is a first necessity commodity. And so it means that there is a relative stability of food demand, while other agricultural commodity for non-food consumption, like cotton, is clearly negatively affected. So for example, the demand for cotton this year is expected to decrease by 13%. So it's a negative shock, very important shock for countries like Benin, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad. And behind the stability of demand for food, of course, you have some modifications in the consumption of, in the behavior of consumers. I do not know exactly the statistic in Africa. In Europe and in North America, it's huge. I guess that in Africa, it's this modification of consumption is slightly smaller, but it means that you have increased demand for consumption at home. So it increased demand for staple food, processed foods and vegetables, and less demand for consumption at restaurants or public eatings. And it means that you have reduced demand for fresh products, milk and meat. At the same time, you have a set of policies that have been implemented. So, for example, lockdown measures, border closures, import restricting sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and you have an impact on transportation. So concerning the transportation, and it causes, of course, disruptions of supply. Why? Because, for example, concerning transportation, the air transportation is very, very affected. So it means it has an implication on high-value products or fresh products that can be no more exported to far countries. And you have sanitary measures that have been implemented at the border, and it affects, of course, the transportation of livestock. Border closure, so usually it happens that you have import bans, but we didn't observe many import bans. What we have observed is the fact that movement of people are forbidden, while the movement of the transportation, the shipments of goods are authorized. And so it has an impact, of course, on seasonal migration, and a negative impact, and also an impact on informal trade in small quantities, because there are many countries, like in Uganda, that cross the border to transport and sell in a marketplace 1 bag of maize, and it's an important livelihood. And now this trade is forbidden in many places in Africa. And of course, it should, we do not have statistics on that, but it should encourage smuggling, which happen in Africa, for example, in a few borders, like between Benin and Nigeria. And finally, lockdown measures are also a very negative impact in Africa. And this is because most of the food supply chain is transitional. That is to say, it is a fragmented sector with many small and medium enterprises, very labor intensive. And it means that they have huge difficulties to sell their products. Concerning, you have also panics, for example, export restrictions, but we have observed this kind of reaction in March and early April, and it has a limited impact. And fortunately, because big exporters like in Eastern Europe and in Asia have implemented export restriction, but it has ended mid-April, and so it had a limited impact on world markets, contrarily to what happened in 2007, 2008. So the implication on world trade is important because there is a huge decrease of world trade at the global level. So by 14.3% in volume in the second quarter of 2020 as compared to the second quarter of 2019, but it affects essentially fuels and manufactured products and less agricultural products. And the reason is that, of course, the demand for food is relatively inelastic. And so the transportation of food has been received some impediments like controls at the border, but it has continued, and there are some types of transportation which is no longer possible, like air transportation, but land transportation, it works, and sea transportation, it also works. So in fact, the agricultural exports at the world level. So you see that on the right side of this graph, it's statistics from the WTO Secretariat. If you look at the first quarter of 2020 as compared to the first quarter of 2019, it has increased by more than 2%. And there are some countries that have exported more than this average. For example, in Africa, in the African continent. And this is because of these differentiated impacts it has on demand for agricultural goods. And at the level of countries, you have countries like Ethiopia, Senegal, Zambia, who have exploited this opportunity to export more than the average, while countries like Madagascar or Mozambique have received a negative impact on their exports of agricultural products. And the reason is related to this differentiated impact that I tried to explain. But at the total level of least developed countries, it's on the right side of the graph, we have an increase in the first quarter of 2020. So the quality of the statistics are not 100% reliable. And this is because it is based on data coming from the International Trade Center in Geneva, which has its statistics from the National Statistical Institute. And the National Statistical Institute in Africa do not have a clear picture of what happens at the border. And so this is a big problem. So and second, another aspect is the fact that it is the first quarter of 2020, and we may expect that in the second quarter, but also in July and August, we have a more negative picture because it's the period of time where the pandemics has a huge impact. So if we look at data, so in terms of prices, they are relatively stable after a decline during the first quarter of 2020, but there is since then a recovery of these prices. But if you try to look at other sources of data, the problem is that you have, for example, the Food Security and Nutrition Working Group. And thanks to Thomas Avuor for giving me access to this data. These are very interesting data. And here you have, in fact, a comparison between the informal trade level at Bulawayo in the border between Somalia and Ethiopia in volume. And it's weekly average over the January-August of each year. So you have 2020 as compared to 5 previous years, and you see that there is no clear pattern. So there is a huge decrease in the trade of cattle, but you have an increase in the trade of sugar and wheat flour. If you look at what happens at Isebania between Kenya and Tanzania, in fact, you have a substantial decrease in 2020 as compared to previous years. And it concerns rice and maize. It's informal trade. And what is important is the fact that if you look at formal trade at the same border, you see that there is an increase. So it means that you have less informal trade, but more formal trade. And the reason is that borders are maybe more severely controlled by custom officials. And so people no longer trade their products informally, but they try to formalize their trade. Of course, the problem is that we do not know exactly how the statistics are systematically collected, because there is a problems of funding these initiatives, which are really important, and they deserve more systematic funding in my mind. I would like to show, yes, I know. Yeah.
Could you please? Thank you.
Yes, yes. And so I would like to show you data from SEALS. It's an initiative in West Africa, where this is an initiative that tries to work with the private sector to collect data on inter-regional trade. And we see a negative pattern in 2020 as compared to previous year. I would like to say that in the short term, governments should encourage the functioning of marketplaces, should open also the borders, because it's an important way of giving higher incomes to farmers, but also giving a cheaper access to food for consumers. In the long term, the openness strategy is the best strategy to put in place, in particular in times of pandemic and rapid climate change. And I think that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can help in this regards if it addresses also the issues of non-tariff measures and the efficiency of custom procedures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bouet, for this very insightful and good presentation. I'm very impressed with how, in a very short period of time, you managed to put together so much information and really come to very clear recommendations and conclusions. We will now move over to the Q&A, and I have a few questions. Let me first ask the first question to Professor Professor Jean-Jacques from ASARECA. That the question is: will indigenous data be considered, especially in value chains? While you answer that question, the next question will go to Antoine. And Antoine, the question would be: curfews under COVID-19 have limited transportation for food. This seems to be leading to substantial losses in fruits, vegetables, and other produce that now gets transported during the day. Do we have an idea of the magnitude of this problem, and how does this affect cross-border trade in Africa? I have another question for you, but these are the two questions I have now. And if time allows, we will come to the other question. So first, you, Professor Jean-Jacques.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tennis. And thank you, Albert, for this challenging question, actually, asking whether in this process of compiling data, information, and knowledge, we will be considering indigenous data on value chains. The answer here is yes, but there is a challenge to that. The challenge is the capture. So how do we capture indigenous data? We probably need to find a way of linking some of that indigenous knowledge and data with the formal data collection systems. As Dr. Antoine has just mentioned, we still have loopholes in the questionnaire and even the methodology that are being used by most of the National Institutes of Statistics in the region. And I believe this whole situation of COVID-19 pandemic is going probably to inform the leaders in those institutions to come up with more innovative ideas and probably additional metrics and additional methodology aspects to capture some of this data. I'm glad that Antoine had showed that in some cases, informal trade is moving towards more formalized cross-border trade, from the example we saw on the border between Kenya and Tanzania. This could probably encourage, that system of linking and coming up with a methodology that captures indigenous knowledge and information as far as value chain development is concerned. And this applies mostly to some staple crops that are grown in some local condition in specific agroecologies. So this is what I can say to this interesting question, Tennis, and back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Jean-Jacques. And I go now to Dr. Bouet. Antoine, could you address the question that I just posed to you?
Yes, concerning curfews, it's true that I received some information, but not in Eastern Africa, in Western Africa, about uncoordinated curfews implemented by many governments in West Africa. And so I say uncoordinated because it was not implemented at the same hour. So it has two very negative implications. First, there are because of the climate, there are many fresh products that are transported by night, and they couldn't be transported no more because of these curfews. And of course, there was a messy implication from the uncoordination because it was not at the same hour of implementations. And so trucks have been stopped at different borders for a very long time, and it was very unnecessary. So I think that I had a discussion in West Africa about the losses and waste of food and fresh products that have been implied by these curfews. And Brahim Assise from SILS in Ouagadougou told me that he estimated that 20% the amount of fresh products wasted or lost because of these curfews. So this is an estimation. We do not have more precise estimation. We are trying to collect systematically data on waste and losses all along the value chain, because it's of course a very important questions, but we are just at the beginning of the process of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boy. I have one quick question for you, and after this, I want to move on to the panelists. And the question is also to you from the university, from the Joshua University of Eswatini. And is there a portal where informal trade statistics over the last 12 months can be assessed? Do you know of such a portal? Antoine.
Yeah. No, we try to put some info. You have different portals. It would be a great idea to build and to design a portal at the African continent level, but we have the food security portal. Sometimes we have information that IFPRI puts in this portal. We have also informations from CILS in Ouagadougou, CILSS, Comité interétatique de lutte contre la sécheresse au Sahel. I also consult very frequently the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, FuseNet. So you have different websites that give you some information on informal trade. But there is no systematic collection of this, and I think that it would be a great idea to have a broad and complete portal that collects information on formal and informal trade at the level of the continent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boy. It's really, I find it always a pity that we are constrained with time, because there's so many questions coming up, and the discussion is really very interesting and extremely relevant, I find. But we will come back to more Q&A later. Let me now proceed with some panel reflections from both national and regional representatives. And I really have the pleasure to invite now the Ambassador, Dr. Kebiego Chelugat. He's from the, I don't know why they took the way it is. He's the Assistant Secretary General of COMESA. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Each of the panelists has up to 10 minutes in this session, and I strongly recommend that we stay within our time. Ambassador, the floor is yours. I cannot hear you, Ambassador. Your Excellency, I cannot hear you. Can you unmute yourself? Yes, you are unmuted.
Can you see me now?
May I suggest that while we work on the background of the audio of His Excellency, that we go to the next presentation, because there seems to be an issue, and we will work on it in the background and then come back to Ambassador Chelugat. If that's okay, then I would like now to call on Mr. Godfrey Walakira, the Principal Commercial Officer of the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Ministry and Cooperatives of Uganda. Mr. Godfrey, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation. And Ambassador, we will come back to you later while we work on the audio. Mr. Godfrey?
Yes, thanks a lot for the dialogue. I don't know whether I'm being seen.
We can see you well, and can hear you very well also.
Okay.
So
Then that's good. Thank you for the wonderful forum. In terms of my presentation, I'm going to focus it in terms of 4 perspectives. Where 1, I'll just give an overview in terms of what do we observe in terms of our trade. Then 2, I'll look at it in terms of the aspects of informal trade, then the impact of COVID, especially in the case for Uganda. Then 3, I'll look at the role of trade, the role of data and information sharing in cross-border trade and food security. And lastly, I'll give what government has done in terms of enhancing cross-border trade in the perspective of Uganda and even the aspect of the regional. So beginning from trade itself, because Uganda, we are in a number of regional integration blocks. So I'll only focus in terms of our trading, where you find we have our neighbors who are in the EAC, that is the East African Community. And I look at it in terms of the EAC intra-trade of processed foods and agro-based foods. Where do we stand as EAC in terms of the bloc? So when we consider the 3 years from 2017 to 2019, we see a drop of EAC intra-exports in terms of processed foods and agro-based foods from 2.4 billion to 1.98 billion. But when you consider what we import from the world, also there was a drop from 33.7 billion to 32.8 billion. Now, when I consider in terms of the key products which may be related to agriculture, we can look at it in terms of like milk and cream. We see imports of milk increasing from $58 million in 2017 to 122 million in 2019. But when you compare with what we get from the world, we see an increase from 98 million to 142 million in 2019. That is EAC. Then where you see like crude palm oil, the EAC intra-trade is still low. It is in the range of 19 million, that was in 2017, but by 2019, it had increased to 58 million. But when you look at what we import from the world, it increased from 56 million to over 98 million. Why am I raising this? It will bring in terms of my conclusion, where should we focus in terms of enhancing our value chains? So in terms of the impact of COVID, let me be specific here in terms of Uganda. In terms of the implementation of the strict measures and lockdown, we started around like the 3rd week of March 2020. And if we are to consider the average exports, what we have been getting monthly in terms of Uganda, like for 2019, we see the monthly average exports in 2019 averaged around $45 million. But after the lockdown, especially beginning from April to August, we see, this is mainly the informal exports, we see a drop from $47 million to averagely less than $1 million. That is in the period of the lockdown. Now there you can really see the impact in terms of what has happened in terms of the cross-border trade, especially focusing in the informal trades. But when you look at it in terms of the formal exports, surprisingly, formal exports, they have performed well, both prior the period of COVID and after COVID. Then, if I was to consider what should the role of trade, the role of data and information sharing in cross-border trade and food security. One, we need to understand the behavior of border communities in terms of what they produce, what is marketed, and what is consumed by the households residing along the border areas. And also to understand what would be the appropriate balance between consumption and trading. You know, COVID brought challenges in terms of what should be the emphasis. At the beginning, we are looking in terms of prevention, in terms of life. That was health. Then the economy came next, and agriculture production. So now the question would be, what would be the balance that would sustain household welfare so that they can be self-sustaining? Then also we need to identify what are the key agriculture value chains that we need to develop for the well-being of Africa and even for Uganda. So when you look at it in terms of our informal cross-border trade, it mainly focuses on agriculture items, which are mainly raw, that is maize, beans. Those are the main ones, which are mainly raw. Then 3, we need to map the key agriculture products to enhance, that is in terms of identifying. If you identified now, like when you see Uganda and Democratic Republic of Congo on that line, if we considered, should the product be the same as we trade with South Sudan and Kenya? So you'd find in terms of the mix of the product mix, it would require understanding in terms of the communities and how can they be empowered to be self-sufficient. And also the other aspect would require, because you find some of the initiatives we've been having, especially like in Uganda, where we have the informal cross-border survey, which is conducted to collect statistics on the informal trade. So you'd find now this would require understanding between the different, at a bilateral level, between the communities, between the two countries. If Uganda is doing informal cross-border survey, our neighbors also doing the same. And what can we share? What experiences can we learn from each other? Then in terms of understanding what would be the parameters, because you know the indicators for data collection vary based on usage and based on the stakeholders involved. So in terms of what would be the key parameters and indicators that would be essential to improve data collection and information when you have a multitude of stakeholders that vary from health, the ones who would be required in food, nutrition, calorie intake, then cross-border trade indicators,
Mr. Godfrey,
then market access indicators like tariffs and non-tariff measures, then also the agriculture-related indicators that start from production, consumption. Then the other aspect now, when you have COVID, you know agriculture is very interesting. You have also the climatic and environmental effects. So how can we distinguish the effects that are coming from both? Now, as I conclude, I would focus on what has government done in terms of enhancing cross-border trade. As the government of Uganda, we are in the process of building cross-border markets. But at the same time, already there is infrastructure of one-stop border posts with all our neighbors. That is Kenya, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Rwanda. The one-stop border posts have been built, and those ones facilitate the movement of trade. Then the other one where we find the informal traders, because informal traders, there is a markup in terms of the value of goods they deal in. They don't exceed more than $2,000. So you find these are more like individual small packages they trade across. So within the EAC and even the COMESA region, I think the Deputy Secretary General will mention, we have what we call the simplified trade regime that allows and enhances the processing of the small traders who have values not exceeding $2,000 to go through a simplified trade process. Then we have the electronic single window where it has been in operation for the past 4 years. This one links with the main agencies that are involved in the trade facilitation chain. Then also there is a trade information portal which gives information relating to the trade procedures and also modernization of customs procedures, where we have a number of modernization strategies that have been done in the customs in terms of enhancing transit movements, clearance of cargo, imports and exports, and lastly, the improvement of quality and standards infrastructure, especially in terms of the agencies that are involved in enhancing the standards, where we have the Uganda National Bureau of Standards, and on the side of agriculture in terms of the SPS requirements. I would say thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godfrey. Asante Sana, was a very insightful presentation. I was struck by the information you gave us with the very sharp decline of informal trade from 47 million to 1 million. It's a huge decrease, if I understood and heard you well. Let me move on to the next presentation. And I'm not sure if the organizers on the ASARECA side could send me a chat letting me know whether or not the ambassador is already connected. In the meantime, sorry.
I'm available now.
Oh, you're available. Wonderful, Ambassador. I'm so happy to hear your voice. And let me keep it short on my side. The floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, so sorry about I had to use my phone now. I don't know what happened to my laptop.
No, we can hear you very well now. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be in this conference, which is will give our perspective on the implication of COVID-19 pandemic on regional cross-border trade, agricultural trade, and related information data sharing from the perspective of COMESA. And I congratulate ASARECA and IFPRI for organizing this meeting. So maybe what I can do is very quickly inform you about COMESA, who we are. We are a regional organization of 21 member states, and our intention is to promote regional integration through trade development. And our vision is to be a fully integrated, internationally competitive regional economic community with high standards of living for all its people, ready to march into the African economic community. Those are our member states, the 21 of them. And you can see very clearly that we are the largest in Africa in terms of the membership. And in terms of people, we also account to more than half of the population of the continent, with 11.8 million square kilometers and a combined GDP of 805 billion. And the fact, of course, is that we are the largest regional economic community in Africa and constitutes a third of the continent. Now, of course, the pandemic has caused a great disruption in the way we do business. And there's strong need for data and information sharing so that we have evidence-based and rapid and timely response. And I think the previous speaker has mentioned the sharp decline in cross-border trade, and I think this is not very difficult to understand. If you look at our border posts, and this has really occupied us quite a bit, you'll find that there is a lot of disruption. Even though intra-COMESA trade had remained sluggish for a long time, I think the pandemic has perhaps made it a little more difficult. And I know that we have mechanisms in which we have enabled trade, and we have institutions that are helping, such as the Yellow Card, which is one of the institutions that allow insurance and that type of thing. But in terms of agricultural trade, we continue to have issues with member states putting in non-tariff barriers, and we work very hard to remove those barriers so that trade can move very quickly. So data and information fuel economic and social opportunities for everyone. And that's the benefit of stimulating increase in regional trade. And maybe what I can also say is that we at the Secretariat have been engaging our member states. We recently had a Council of Ministers meeting in which we some guidelines to deal with the COVID situation and cross-border trade was adopted. And I think those guidelines are now in operation. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the importance of data quality challenges that affect effectiveness and timeliness of interventions, incomplete harmonization of statistical standards across our member states that also lead to inconsistent ways of recording. And we also know there is low technological leverage to maximize the usage of available data, and the lack of enough financial and human resources in investment in the issue of data. However, we need data that speaks to the needs for policy. We also need good quality data as measured by statistical quality assessments. And in this regard, we in the Secretariat have quite a robust statistical unit, and that publishes data that can be very useful to our policymakers. In this case, in our case, is our Council of Ministers. We also are developing data that is accessible, and in this case, we are able to. We recently launched a digital platform for sharing information by our member states, and we're hoping that that information portal will also include important data and information that will enable trade to continue during this during the post-COVID era. And of course, we have to leverage digital technology for data collection, analysis, and dissemination. And there has to definitely be a paradigm shift in terms of treating data as a strategic asset. When it comes to what we are doing currently, we are enabled by Article 140 of our treaty to develop comprehensive information systems to provide policy context for developing statistics. In this regard, we are also developing our next MTSP 2021-2025, and it's recognized that statistics is extremely important. We also have a two-tier strategy, the Commercial Statistics Strategy 2021 to 2025, which is also being developed specifically to provide a blueprint and implementation for statistics, including agriculture and cross-border trade. There's definitely a need for a regional strategy around statistical development. And as far as agriculture is concerned, so agriculture-related data is extremely important. And as you know, agricultural, I think the previous speaker mentioned something called the STR, Simplified Trade Regime. This is really for small-scale trade. And we in COMESA really emphasize on that. And if we had enough data, accurate data to see the importance of this small-scale cross-border trade, then it's really important.
Sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to. Oh, you're on the conclusion. Sorry, I didn't see. Okay, sorry. Please proceed. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, so I'm towards the end actually, and I wanted to say that definitely we welcome this conference, and we want to collaborate with other organizations. We are working very closely with ASARECA, and I'm very sure that we can also work closely with IFPRI in terms of ensuring that our member states receive enough data. So I thank you, Chair, and maybe if there are any questions, we can address those later.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Your Excellency, you gave a really wonderful presentation and very clearly emphasized the importance of partnership, collaboration, and working together. We're all working in so many different fields, and I think there's a lot of synergy to see how we can join hands. So your final slide is very relevant in that regard, the joining of hands. I would like to call now on Dr. Fadel Ndiami, the Deputy President of AGRA. Sir, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, moderator. It really gives me great pleasure to take the floor after the brilliant expose from the ambassador and the other speakers. And on behalf of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, we are very pleased to take part of this discussion. So, moderator, I'd like just to build my contribution into three major points. Firstly, I'll tell you very briefly about my organization and why we have to be in this conversation, why we are very interested in partnering, and I want to seize the plea by the ambassador, our willingness to collaborate with all the partners around here. So that will be my first point. The second point would be just to go back to the COVID context that has been very clearly analyzed and articulated by all the the other speakers. But just to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities that call for evidence-based policy making for greater transparency and predictability in terms of regional food trade. And finally, I will share some specific initiative that my organization, AGRA, is involved in, with some of the organizations actually participating in this meeting. So the first part, very quickly, as most of you know, AGRA is an African organization. We define ourselves as being a farmer-centered, African-led, and partnership-driven. And at the core of our mandate is really to drive an inclusive agricultural transformation on the continent as the basis for driving our economy. I mean, the argument for that is very clear, given not only the potential of agriculture, but also the significance of the numbers of people and institutions working around that. In that context, what we're specifically trying to contribute to is really to drive smallholder farming from a solitary struggle for survival to a business that thrives. And we believe that regional food trade, cross-border trade, will play a significant role in making it happen for reasons that have been already articulated. And for the current strategic plan that will end in 2021, our goal is really to contribute to increase income of at least 30 million farm households, but also work with 11 African countries in building and driving their own agricultural transformation. So that's basically AGRA. And the reason why we are very pleased to be invited in this conversation is as part of our delivery program, we have an initiative that we call Regional Food Trade and Resilience Initiative that is supported by the United Kingdom Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, and our other PIATA partners. Our PIATA partners are the Partnership for Inclusive Agricultural Transformation. And what this program seeks to do and to achieve is basically to provide support to the regional economic communities and national government, specifically in the area of data gathering, monitoring, in order to drive their policy pertaining to food security, trade, prices, which, as we know, are key ingredients to the policy predictability and the transparency that we refer to. We also provide specific support to government as they really develop their policy and regulatory reform that are for more open trade that have been highly outlined during this conversation, but also that will encourage private sector investment in regional value chain. I mean, one of the presenters spoke about West Africa. I mean, I think we know there are many initiatives around rice, And we are aware of many of the initiatives that ECOWAS and others are spearheading to make sure that there is a concerted effort around right production, processing, distribution, and consumption in the region. Because of that focus on value chain, we are also providing specific support to off-takers and processors and traders to make sure that we can build a much more resilient supply chain of food. So that's what this program is trying to do. Therefore, we believe that this conversation is very timely for us, and I think it also gives us an opportunity to share not only what we're doing, but our willingness to leverage and collaborate with everybody else who is in this space. Now, COVID, I don't think I have to spend too much time. I think it has been very highlighted before. We know the pandemic has really brought about significant shocks and disruption in the way policy and economies are run around around the world, but also specifically in our country. In the case of AGRA, because of the focus of our work across several regions of the continent, when the pandemic started, we are very concerned about the impact in different regions, given the differences in cropping calendar. As you are aware, while Southern Africa, Mozambique, Malawi were basically at their harvest season, East Africa, some of the countries were planting, West Africa was still preparing. So it was very clear to us, it was important to have an evidence-based driven policy in terms of mitigation of the calamities. Now, we know the shock that have been created, and I will not go too much about it. I think what I want to highlight is there are also some secondary effects that are linked to COVID-19 and that has been also analyzed earlier, and that come from the way most governments responded to the crisis. In the absence of data and evidence, some of the reaction was mainly driven by ad hoc decision making. I mean, some would say knee-jerk policy making based on panic, speculation, and lack of data. I think the point is action should be driven by evidence, and for that, data is required. And I think this is why, as part of the initiative that I mentioned earlier, we are investing significantly in generation of accurate market information, not only in production, domestic marketing, consumption, utilization, distribution in the country, but also the flow across the countries. And as we all understand that this is essential for helping government, private sector, and farmers make the right decision to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and all the crises, that happen in the same period. So part of that effort also leverages on existing partnership. I'm happy to mention our partnership with the regional economic communities, including COMESA, ECOWAS, and ECA, but also our ability to leverage on other initiatives, because the key here is partnership. This is a collective crisis. It requires collective effort. Specific initiative we're doing around market information system to make sure that we are able to generate data on prices, stocks, flow across the board. The timely generation and dissemination of this information are seen as essential to enable government to improve the regulation of the food market, to prevent panic buying by consumers that we experience in most of our countries, but also to help farmers make rational decisions on what to grow given the trend around what the market is look like. And
Dr.
here we
Fadel,
are. Yes.
You have 3 more minutes.
Okay, that's fine. I think I should conclude. So the specific thing I want initiative is we have an effort around the regional food balance sheet, which exactly is a tool that enable the regional economic community, but also the countries to have visibility on level of availability needs, to know areas of gaps that can be met with areas of surplus. The second, and I'm very happy to say that we are doing an initiative in East and Southern Africa around this regional food balance sheet. We also have similar initiative in West Africa working with SILS and ECOWAS. Another element of the program is what we call the political economy analysis, which help us understand some of the softer issues related to that are preventing the regional food trade to happen. And based on that information, the stakeholders and the interested government are able to make the right decision that enable a free flow of goods and service across the board. Final initiative that I want to highlight is what we call the Food Security War Room. That is an effort that is helping African government basically to enhance their preparedness in dealing with issue of food security and food monitoring. And it entails a significant effort to collect data from all sources and a partnership across public and private sector actors. I think Kenya has provided significant leadership in the context of COVID, and other African countries are now reaching out in order to learn from that experience moving forward. Finally, I want to highlight that a year ago, we set up what we call the Regional Food Trade Coalition as part of the AGRF. And that coalition involves several organizations, public, private, local, international, all committed in promoting cross-border trade and regional food trade. We have, in that context, we have two specific task teams that I want to highlight. One focus on issue of gender and trade, and the other one on the issue of nutrition. So with this, I just want to end by thanking you again for the invitation and letting you know that we are more than ever open and willing to strengthen our collaboration around generating data analytics for transparency and predictability that is required for a proper regional food trade. I thank you for your attention.
Dr. Fadel, thank you so much for this very impressive presentation, and really very impressive to see how quickly AGRA, in partnership with others, has responded to the pandemic and set up activities and responses. So thank you so much for these insights. We now come to the Q&A, and I have a few questions that I would like to address and like the panelists and the presenters to address. So first to Professor Jean-Jacques. The question that we would like you to address is: clearing of goods at the border sites due to delays in testing truck driver is limiting trade across African countries and ultimately food security. The logistics industries seem not to be adjusting. It would be nice to know the extent it is affecting the region. So that is a question for you, Professor Jean-Jacques. Then I come to Dr. Bouet. Harmonizing food standards and checking of imports and export regulations is crucial to improve trade within Africa. What is your perspective here? I come to Mr. Godfrey. There are two questions. Let me address first one to you. How can data for cross-border trade help the local farmers in rural setting, since COVID-19 has locked them from their customers from cross-border? Okay. And then I come to Your Excellency, the Ambassador. What strategy, or are there any strategies to improve food security during the restrictions of COVID-19? So I would like each of you to address the question that I asked you, and I would be happy to repeat them if you wish. But Professor Jean-Jacques, the floor is first yours.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for this question. It's very obvious that all the countries have put in place some travel restrictions, including at the border posts, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And this is the case in Eastern and Central Africa region as well. So now to the question asked to me, the answer is yes, definitely all the restrictions that have been put in place, including testing truck drivers and other control mechanisms, have affected the movement of not only output product, but also input product. Where we sit in Eastern Africa, we have a number of countries that are landlocked, including Uganda, where we're sitting from. And most of the import products, especially inputs, come through Tanzania or Mombasa port post in Kenya. And when they reach the borders now, either at entry point in Uganda or any other places, all these testing mechanisms that have been put in place create delays, and probably farmers in some of those countries miss out the opportunity to use input. This has happened for the case of countries that are still importing fertilizers and seeds. So we don't have the correct and up-to-date statistics to which extent this has been, has created disruptions. Probably as the colleague from the ministry in Uganda, when he takes his question, if he has some numbers as far as Uganda is concerned, because Uganda is one of the countries that have implemented strict measures as far as truck drivers is concerned at all the border posts with Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and even DRC. Godfrey, if you have a few numbers, you can probably give it, but definitely this is something that needs to be documented moving forward. Otherwise, there's no question that the processes have impacted the food security in the region. Over to you, Dennis.
Thank you so much, Professor Jean-Jacques, for this answer. And Godfrey, Mr. Godfrey, we'll come back to you in a second. Let me first go back to. Actually, let me first come to you, Godfrey, because Professor Jean-Jacques asked you to add to his response, and then we come to Dr. Bouet.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. In terms of how data can help local farmers, after knowing the challenges that have risen because of the cross-border effects caused by COVID, I think I would first tackle it in such a way that by saying, starting by end of September, we have seen the easing of lockdowns in most of our countries, especially in the EAC, where we have seen the borders. Most countries have started opening the borders. So that means there is a likelihood of traders now starting to move. So in terms of understanding the impact, I think the impact of just opening, because now like us for Uganda, the borders have just been opened by 2nd October. Where you find Kenya, it was I think by mid-August. Tanzania has been open. Rwanda also opened within the same range of end of September. So we shall see a movement in terms of trying to see an increase. But the other aspect would be, because you see, other than focusing on the cross-border countries or the international markets, there's a likelihood where we see, if data has been improved, where we can collect in terms of understanding what are the current demands based on the domestic requirements, that is in terms of the regions. Some of these foods can easily be distributed locally, assuming logistics and supply are matching. But the only challenge you'll find, people, because of ignorance, they wouldn't know what would be now like the price that is being fetched in a different locality within the country. But in terms of the data, it can improve local farmers by enabling them to identify in terms of what are the current pricing in the region, locally, assuming on the Ugandan market, knowing what is the current price of the products they are producing that can easily be marketed across within Uganda. That would assist them to get an alternative market. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Bouet to respond to his question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very interesting question, and the questions of standard and harmonizations of standards, in particular because many African countries have adopted in the last 10 to 15 years many sanitary and phytosanitary standards and technical barriers to trade, and this is normal because, of course, governments are concerned with the safety of food products. I just want to. The problem is that it is also an impediment to trade, and it is difficult to estimate how much it is an impediment. So what we did recently is what I'm going to do is just to show you one slide. This is. What we did is that we did an estimation of what is the the custom duty, which is equivalent to sanitary, phytosanitary measures in different African countries. And in Zimbabwe, for example, it is equivalent to an import tariff of more than 160%, while in Mali, it is close to 50%. So it's a big issue, the questions of harmonizations of standards. But it is also a very difficult process because, of course, countries do not want to give up their standards, and but there is other way to do that. It is to adopt mutual recognition of standards, and it has been the case in Europe, and it's much more easier because you do not adopt a foreign standards for your food products, but you recognize the standards of other countries. So I think it's a very important issue, and it must be addressed by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or at the regional level. So for example, in Eastern African Community or at the level of the COMESA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for this response. Your Excellency, Ambassador, would you like to respond to the question if there are any strategy to improve food security during the restrictions of COVID-19? Any adaptations of strategy or new strategies?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is indeed a very good question, and I think I did mention that at the outset of the pandemic, very early on, I think in the month of April, was it May? My colleagues in the Secretariat, we developed some guidelines to allow countries, to enable them to ease maybe movement. Partly also it was aimed at moving essential items such as pharmaceuticals and so on, but also essential food items. So these guidelines were adopted by our ministers and they have been published. And I guess they are actually binding to member countries. So if they can actually follow those guidelines, it could be a pointer to this. But as you know, sometimes regional agreements and so on may not be obeyed or may not be effected, but we continue to convince meetings with our member countries to enable them to follow those guidelines. At the Secretariat level also, we've been participating together with other regional economic communities such as the ESC in the development of what we call the Commons Project, which is maybe an aim to create a health passport so that people who are crossing can actually have this digital health passport. So we hope that in the long run, this can be adopted and that can actually ease the movement of trucks and truck drivers. But since our aim has always been to improve cross-border trade, we have a number of projects and programs going on at the moment, targeting cross-border trade. So development of, for example, cross-border markets and improvement of the cross-border points, such as the one-stop border post. And we've received support from the European Union to implement this. And this program is targeting about maybe 5 or so cross-border, border points. And I think as mentioned earlier by one of the presenters, our simplified trade regime is perhaps really one of those that would help the small scale traders. So our member countries are committed to implementing this simplified trade regime. And with this, then small scale traders can cross, and mostly it could also be agricultural products, and that can also help in the food security of our region. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your response to this important question. I was given executive permission to go slightly over time, not much. I won't tell you from who this executive permission came, but I will go very slightly. I want to ask a very short question to Dr. Fadel, and then we'll hand over to the closing words. So, Dr. Fadel, could you very briefly respond to the following question, please? How is the Regional Food Balance Initiative implemented in the context of multi-country program? Would be glad to hear more about that. Is it possible to give maybe a 1 or maximum 2-minute response to this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think probably it's a product that speaks to the challenge that COVID poses to all countries. You have country level policies, but you have regional coordination platform, such as the regional economic community. The regional food balance sheet is actually a platform that we are building currently with ECOWAS, COMESA, and others, to make sure that at the regional level, you can have data visibility on the level of production, consumption, trade that enable to surface how surpluses in some countries can match deficit in other countries. I think it's really an evidence-based policy and decision-making that enable cooperation to take place in the context of COVID. I think earlier, some of the panelists mentioned the uncoordinated nature of the national responses, yet those markets are regional. If you talk about the rice market, any of the market we're talking about actually cross the different borders in an informal way. Having a policy framework to harmonize the standard, make sure that there is attempt to enhance cooperation through trade corridor and other mechanisms is something that the regional food balance sheet aim to contribute to. I think in 2 minutes is what I can say.
Thank you, sir. You can say more in 2 minutes than I could even possibly imagine. So it was wonderful. Thank you so much for your response. I would like to now move over to the wrap-up and closing. And let me first call on Dr. Rob Vos to give his closing remarks.
Thank you, Teunis, and thank to all the panelists and presenters for a very interesting discussion. It's very heartening to see how much progress has been made in trying to improve data systems for measuring trade and link that to food security. Of course, the challenges are still very big, but I think we have a good basis to think through how we can cooperate more across these initiatives, but then also particularly integrate the improved data systems and measurement methods with analytical tools that can help then underpin investment priority setting through which we can better facilitate trade and trade integration in Africa. So I think this has been a very good start. As usual, there's not enough time, there's never enough time, but I think this is a very productive basis. So let me run ahead of further conversations we have with Jean-Jacques and colleagues at ASARECA, but maybe we should plan a follow-up meeting to this to delve deeper in how we can accelerate these initiatives and forge this cooperation, which I think would help tap into the potential that increased inter-regional trade has in Africa for building more resilient food systems. So let me use that by way of my conclusion. I promised this follow-up event, but not without thanking all of you for your collaboration, your participation, the good questions that were raised by all of the attendees, and particularly also the organization with ASARECA and the support at IFPRI to make this happen, and specifically also from the side of the Food Security Portal to the European Commission for the financial support provided to make this event possible. With that, let me hand it back to you, Teunis, and again, underline the promise that we will have the follow-up event, and also what several have asked for, whether we can share the presentation, we will do that. We'll also make a short report from this event, and we'll use that as a basis to plan a follow-up event. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for these closing remarks. Really appreciate it. And I would like now to move over and to invite Dr. Warinda, the Deputy Executive Director of ASARECA, to make his closing remarks. Dr. Warinda, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the invitation. And I believe that because we are running over time, and Dr. Rob has also mentioned some important points, allow me to first of all also add my voice by thanking all the participants, thanking all the panelists. And I just want to mention that there are critical issues that have come up. And one is that the empirical evidence of the economic effects of the COVID-19 on the cross-border trade exists. And what is now important is how do we work together after this webinar? How do we work together to ensure that access to the data and information are generated and are availed and are accessed by everybody? The ambassador also mentioned that there is a great importance in ensuring partnerships and collaboration. How are we going to work together in ensuring that, for example, with AGRA's regional food balance sheet, the IFPRI's portals that they are managing, the ASARECA's KI hub that we are putting together, how can we bring all these portals together so that together with COMESA's portals, we are able to service the demands within our continent? So I believe that as a way forward, based also on what is required with regards to the quality data, the quality information, or proven data sources, we need to think after this, how do we move forward? I believe that from the ASARECA side, we are ready. We will link up with the AGRA, we will link up with IFPRI and COMESA. And if possible, if we come up with a technical team that can bring all that have been discussed in this webinar and clearly form a way forward and bring an implementation plan. How do we start actualizing all that we have already discussed here? How do we make data available? How do we share? How do we make sure that we follow up with the subsequent meetings? So back to you, Chair. I believe that this is a very, very important starting point. So we will be communicating on what do we do after this to make this a reality, not just a one-off meeting, but a subsequent implementation schedule. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warinda. The words you just spoke were exactly also in my mind. So we've noticed so many different things going on, and everybody expressing a wish to work together and to collaborate and to partner. I think you mentioned exactly what I was thinking. How do we now move this forward? And this is our next step. So this is the beginning of a very important journey that we are embarking on. I would like to thank everybody who participated in this, the speakers, the panelists, the participants, those who worked so hard in the background to get this, to have this organized, Julian, Jenna, Lisa, Alice, etc. All those people who really have been involved in getting this very important policy dialogue organized and done. A big thank you, Asante Sana, merci beaucoup, and I look forward to the follow-up of this. We will make sure that the presentations are shared, that the report is shared with all the participants, and that there will be also a follow-up. So thank you so much, and have a very nice evening, day, and see you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fadel. Thank you, Ambassador.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Jacques. That's great.
Good evening and a good day for others.
Asante, thank you.
We appreciate it.